Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Few things generate more public anguish or media column inches than our transport system, particularly our roads and our rail and bus networks. And the start of 2023 has done us proud in this area, delivering the road review, the claim to, well, a mixed fanfare, and some interesting byproducts from the fallout. Our rail industry has been knocked sideways with a 40% increase in the cost of the much heralded South Wales Metro, and buses are awaiting announcement on the expected loss of continued emergency pandemic funding. It's safe to say that it's not been the best year for the traveller. Joining us tonight to discuss transport in Wales are Ed Evans, the Director of the Civil Engineering Contractors Association Wales and Trustee of Pedal Power. Hello, Ed.
Hi.
Aaron Hill, the Director of the Confederation of Passenger Transport in Wales. Hello, Aaron.
Hi, Matt. Great to be here.
Thank you very much for being here. And Paula Renzel, Welsh Roads and Climate Campaigner for Transport Action Network Cymru. Hello, Paula.
Hello.
Thank you so much all for being with us today. Ed, we're going to start with you. The roads review has obviously been quite a big thing for your membership at SECA, but can you talk us through a little bit about what's been announced and how the road building sector has reflected on this?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, I wouldn't say it was a bolt from the blue, to be honest with you. And I think as a sector, we've been quietly trying to get on with decarbonising, whether it be our own activities, whether it be in the roads network, transport, energy, etc. So it wasn't a surprise in that respect. And to be honest with you, I think, looking at across the whole of the UK and maybe beyond as well, I'd argue it's quite a bold step from the Welsh Government, and it's something that I suspect that other governments will have to follow in some shape or form. They might not call it a roads review, they might call it something else, but I suspect they will have to. But we're kind of seeing some movement in England, for instance, with some slowing down of roads projects. Some of them probably because of investment issues and the current economic climate, but I suspect there's a few environmental issues in there. I think more specifically for us, in my role as representing civil engineering contractors, these are businesses. They employ huge amounts of people across the board, probably about 6,000 directly in Wales. That's it. That's an Airbus. That's a Tata plus. So big economic contributors. And I think what's been disappointing, I suppose, is the lack of engagement throughout this process with the sector. There has been some engagement, but not a great deal. But, we knew which way it was going, but it would have still been good to have had that engagement just to give some kind of reassurance and some certainty, if you can call it that, for these businesses. It's taken a lot longer than it was expected to take as well, which again hasn't particularly helped. However, we are where we are. There's some pretty challenging conditions in the report. It'll be interesting to see how many of those actually are stuck to in the future, because I think some of the issues around economic development, I think, will be challenging, if not for this government, then for future governments. Nevertheless, it's good to get it out there. And now we need to crack on now and start doing stuff. That in itself is going to be challenging in this current economic climate. But yeah, look, we're probably a little bit more positive than you might think from the original question.
So can you talk a little bit about how that engagement from government occurred and how much they sort of let you in on before the announcement was made?
I think it's fair to say probably didn't, and I can understand why. There would have been people from the industry on the panel. That's one thing, but they're individuals as opposed to representing businesses and different bodies. So minimal, I guess. We have been able to make. There were certain engagement sessions where we were able to make an input, but it was fairly limited. That said, I mean, what we need to see now is the engagement now. So we can see what this means, like in terms of projects. Effectively, there'll be less roads, but I expect there to be a lot more expenditure on the maintenance of these highway assets, and a lot more expenditure in terms of buses, active travel. We've seen it to a degree, but not a huge amount. That's the bit the business, we accept. There's no point dwelling on the past. We accept it's happened. We need to move on. We need to address the climate challenge, but we now need to see some concrete plans, excuse the pun, but some concrete plans of how this is going to look like in the future, so that businesses can plan for the future and employ people. There is an economic aspect to this.
Paula, I mean, maybe not everybody was expecting Ed to be so optimistic, but you, of course, were very positive about the roads review announcement and what it outlined. Could you explain why you took that position and what your reflections were on the announcement of the roads review panel?
Absolutely. I mean, it's very nice to hear from Ed as well. And I just read the blog post that you wrote about it. and which was, yeah, I mean, quite positive, frankly. From our perspective, the decision that Welsh Government took is a landmark decision and is one that we hope will encourage lots of other people to do the same. And as Ed said, it wasn't a surprise, it's needed. We just can't continue the way that we've been doing it. And so, yeah, I think I was actually working at Sustrans when we first saw the roads review in the agenda for the Senedd, and I was wondering what it was at the time. And seeing it a couple of years onwards now, it's quite amazing to see what it's done, really. There is lots of issues and there's lots of things that need to be ironed out and things that need to be solved and criticisms that need to be made. However, as a standalone decision, it was quite groundbreaking, and it really, really departs from most other countries' aspect on transport or perspective on transport. England, well, obviously being one of them. And so, yeah, Wales is very much leading the way on that. Obviously, lots of things need to be done now, but it was very, very important that that decision was made, and Wales is leading the way as a small nation on that.
Do you think it is a standalone decision, though? Because if you look at decisions the Welsh Government have made in the past, say the cancelling of the M4 Relief Road project, this is just building on from those kind of decisions, isn't it? Should we have really expected any grand detour? Pardon the pun. There's so many road puns in this episode today. Should we expect any grand detour from these kind of plans if this is the work that the Welsh Government have already embarked upon?
No, what I mean by standalone is that the Welsh Government is quite alone in having made those decisions, rather than it makes sense in terms of the kind of line that the Welsh Government have been taking over the last few years. However, it's quite something to do still in the face of adversity and controversy. I mean, it's you can see how controversial it has been, and it still is. And so, yeah, I think the Welsh Government is doing something very bold here, and that needs to be recognised.
Aaron, I don't know if you want to comment on the road review in itself and, the decision to stop road building, new road building in Wales, really. But what I really wanted to draw out from you was, the criticism the report has faced is around that it's done what it's done without really looking or commenting on the support needed to pick up the slack that such a policy will engender. So, the wider transport sectors are not getting any other obvious support to really address the kind of fallback in the road industry. So what's the bus industry take on the policy?
Yeah, Kerry, I think it's quite interesting hearing Ed and Paolo talk about, their perspectives. So I think if you read the runes, the outcome of the road review has been on the cards for a little while. We've got this framework, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which people talk about extensively, and we need to start seeing more decisions being delivered within that framework. This very much speaks to that longer term ambition. And from a bus industry's perspective, to see such explicit terms in there around the desire for modal shift in any future road building is fantastic. I suppose the contradiction that we see is that very close to this road review, we also saw the decision around bus funding or bus emergency funding coming to an end. And it just feels like a significant contradiction in terms to say that we are taking this long-term view to cancel future road building, but really stringent constraints in place, really, around any future roads that would be built, and with a positive intention towards public transport, but at the same time cutting the funding for public transport now. And, the government has real aspirations around modal shift, real positive aspirations around modal shift, and the bus industry wants to work with them on that. Bus and coach industry, we will need both pulling in the same direction for that to happen. But the decisions, the short-term decisions around funding taken today will have long-term implications. I'm talking to members all over the country every day who are saying that the removal of funding might not just mean, we use the headline 15 to 20% of routes being cut across Wales, but for smaller operators, it might mean their business goes under completely. It might mean the fleet, the vehicles, the drivers are removed from circulation. And so we end up with this kind of conflicting policy that should be complementary, if you see where I'm coming from. And I think we talk a lot about joined up decision making. We talk a lot about engagement's already been mentioned. And Llywelyn Newydd, the transport strategy for Wales, talks about co-producing our transport strategy, engaging users, engaging the industry. And I think it's pretty clear that people don't feel engaged in this. So while the principle is good, the framework is good, and even the kind of aspiration, I think there are some contradictions within what's happening overall within transport policy related to this at the moment.
without trying to offend our guests, I've got a question for Matt, even though he's hosting tonight. But Matt, you probably watch more of the Senedd than anyone else on the pod. But there was a kind of interesting political side to the roads review, where the Welsh Government ended up voting with the opposition on an amendment. Can you just talk us through that kind of interesting political soundbite? What exactly happened there again?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it all boils down to that word that Aaron just used, then, engagement. So, in the very practical terms, you had a Welsh Conservative opposition debate on the roads review, which basically criticised the decision, expressed regret that there had been a lack of sufficient engagement with communities and businesses and basically the entirety of Wales about the decision. Plaid Cymru put an amendment forward to that debate. It was slightly watered down, but still expressed regret over the lack of engagement from the Welsh Government and the panel with the announcement that was subsequent to come by the roads review panel. So Welsh Labour had not put forward an amendment to that debate, which is usually what they do on an opposition debate, and they usually, because they have the numbers to do so, they normally change those motions and vote for something they're very happy with. This time around, they couldn't do that because they had themselves not put forward an amendment in time. But due to the pressures of certain backbenchers in the Welsh Labour group, it appeared very likely that had they not voted for this watered down amendment, that certain Labour backbenchers could have even voted for the Conservative amendment, which would be much more critical of the Welsh Government and much more embarrassing for them. So essentially what Welsh Labour did is they voted for the Plaid Cymru amendment, which expressed some regret that there had been a lack of engagement over the process.
It really was quite an interesting political sideshow from the roads review there. But bring this back on track, away from the politics and more to the policy. Ed, some of the people I've spoken to about it all said that moving away from new road building for the industry isn't totally a bad thing. It might mean that there's more impetus on addressing the infrastructure we've already got, so repairing what we have. And I don't think there's any shortage of road repairs out there. I was cycling in Cardiff today, and potholes remain a nemesis for active travel, never mind the new routes we've got. But, the example that sticks to my mind is the recent Menai Bridge, which was closed literally overnight. Our building infrastructure, the civil engineering teams have got a lot of work to do still, even if we're not building new, haven't they?
Yeah, look, I think apart from a few companies who really do depend on these large projects coming through, because they're employing hundreds of people, so they do depend upon them for that continuity. I won't name them here, but in terms of some we say smaller contractors in particular, smaller businesses, then they probably have benefited from that redirection of work into active travel schemes, maybe even some bus corridor schemes, and into the rail sector as well. So from that point of view, it's not, people have you've got to adapt, haven't you, as businesses, just to make sure that you can survive. So that's been okay. I think one of the things that we are currently disappointed about, in fact, I'm just in the process of writing to the Deputy Minister on this, is the lack of investment or shift of investment into that maintaining our assets. And it's not just the transport sector, is it? Let's face it, it's the water sector, it's the energy sector. You don't get as many votes, do you, from saying we're going to really maintain all this stuff that we've got. Who cares? You want the shiny schemes, don't you? The shiny projects. So, we've had decades of underinvestment here, but we're not really seeing that coming through at the moment. We're starting a financial year. We have no idea what the government's plans are in terms of their investment into the highway network. We just don't. I suspect it'll be a lot less because of things like overspends on the rails, in the rail sector. But unless you've got that unless you're planning for the future, that was going to be our silver lining, should we say? The businesses were going to be able to invest into this, and not just invest in doing the old stuff of just chucking a load of tarmac down, but actually looking at new materials, different kinds of materials that don't have as much of a carbon impact. Because, if we're going to maintain these things, there's no point doing them the same way we used to do, because that'll just mean quarrying more stuff, sticking more tar into things, fossil fuels and all the rest of it. And really just, we haven't shifted the carbon agenda forward. So if you've got that level of investment coming through, you can start to plan for that. You can get business to invest in new techniques, new practices, new materials. They ain't going to do that if they haven't got the investment. So I think, for me, this has always been as much as possible, a partnership between government and business. And a small country, we keep saying it, don't we? Team Wales, small country, we can be, quick and agile, and we can do all of this. But you have to work with, public sector has to work better with the private sector to do that. It still feels sort of cloak and dagger. We won't tell you what our plans are until it's probably too late for you to plan anything properly. So that is a big disappointment. That's what's kind of in my letter to the Deputy Minister, really. Let's have some certainty. Let's have some visibility on this. And then the private sector will step up and do some good stuff, but not if it's not in the current sort of transactional way, which is almost like a master-servant type of relationship. That doesn't help any of us.
Some pretty shocking statements in there, Ed. I think we're going to come on to the rail industry a little later. But Paula, I just want to pick up on that with you. I think Ed's really positive about what the industry can do, and particularly in changing the sustainability of the kind of infrastructure development. But I think it's fair to say we really do need that infrastructure maintained well. And as I mentioned, it's nice to have the separated out active travel routes, but most active travel is still on normal roads, and we need those services to be suitable to get people out there on bikes and walking more, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a lot to say about all this. I mean, the Third Menai Crossing is quite an interesting one for that, because it kind of brought North Wales into stark focus as well. And I live just 20 minutes from Menai Bridge, and North Wales has a serious lack of underinvestment in infrastructure, but that shouldn't be shiny big road building projects that we can't afford anyway. But it could really do with having actual funding and investment into decent alternatives, because the public transport around here is absolutely shocking. I have many friends who rely on public transport and who struggle getting around. I myself bought a vehicle again moving up north because it was the best way to get around. And I think we need to really, really take a look now at how do we actually transition from, we are no longer investing in these damaging projects, but we are now offering the right alternatives for the people in the places that need it most. And yeah, obviously North Wales is one of these examples with Menai Bridge. I don't think we need a third bridge. It's a very emotional issue, but I also think there is lots that can be done on the resilience of the network in terms of public transport before we build a new bridge that we will struggle to maintain further down the line as well.
Aaron, one of the things you mentioned earlier around the bus and coach industry, that really does rely on the infrastructure we've got. And if we want people to leave their cars, we need the bus sector to really be able to maximise the availability of good infrastructure. Do you see the bus sector really being able to step up and deliver that replacement to cars, what we need?
Look, I think for me, the point Ed made around investment in existing infrastructure is really, really important here. That you touched on the state of the roads at the moment, Kerry. That is a disincentive to buses. It damages buses. It makes it harder and increases our costs. And we need to think about that. But equally, we've seen investment in existing infrastructure throughout the pandemic in terms of the huge amount of money that went into active travel. Fantastic. No one's going to criticize that. It meets the aspiration that we're all working towards. But we've not seen the same investment in bus priority, for example. And clearly, one of the drivers here is not just the principles behind well-being of future generations. It's not just the decarbonisation of our transport system. It's also been the fiscal reality that Welsh Government face in terms of its ability to invest in some of those big projects at the moment. So I appreciate that the challenge financially is enormous for Welsh Government, but the value for money of investing in bus priority lanes, for example, the modal shift that brings, the savings it brings to other parts of the public purse will be enormous in time. So yes, in short, the bus industry is up for it, but we need certainty. We need there to be an incentive to catch the bus, and at the moment we don't really have either of those things. So the conversation at the moment with Welsh Government, they've put out a statement on Friday with us, which is that the emergency funding will come to an end at the end of the school term. That looks like it for emergency funding for the bus industry in Wales. The question then is going to be what's commercial, what works already, and what stacks up. And let's be clear, the financial legal obligation on private bus companies, is that they can only run what's commercial. unless there's government funding available. Then the next question is going to be, which gaps that remain does government want to plug? Because we can't get all of the people that were catching the bus during the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, back on the bus, there will be some underspend from the money that provides concessionary fares. So, we could look at using that. But the question at the moment is about how we sustain what we've got rather than how we get to the next stage. And that's a pretty depressing conversation to walk into. 6 weeks, 6 weeks into this job, I'd like to be having the conversation about modal shift around, how do we reach those really aspirational targets the Welsh Government has? But it's a fight for survival at the moment. And that's not a great place to be. So, let's get some stability into the sector for the next 12, 18 months. Let's create a set of circumstances where we can actually get people back on the bus, because the numbers still aren't where we need them to be. And then perhaps that longer term conversation can flow from there.
Ed, what Aaron mentioned there about the realities of Welsh Government fiscal envelope and budgets, the one area in Wales which is having a kind of bit of a boom time and the biggest investment since Victorian times is some of our rail industry. Really interesting topic for me, for anyone who's listened to the pod before, bus v rail. But the South Wales Metro has, however, hit the buffers a little bit, 40% over budget announced recently. That's going to sting somewhat in terms of those kind of fiscal envelopes. It's fair to say that these kind of infrastructure projects do go overboard and the pandemic. So should we be too worried about that kind of position?
Yeah, well, there's a number of things in that, Kerry. I think first thing, just before we leave Aaron and the buses, I've got to be honest. I think buses is the quick, easy win in so many of these things, because rail projects are damn expensive. They really are expensive, and they don't necessarily. Well, I'll come back to the core values, but they don't always pick up perhaps as many people and communities as you'd like them to. Whereas a bus, it just does. So that's my own personal thing. I'd love to see more investment in the buses, to be honest with you. As far as the cost of infrastructure, more generally is concerned, yeah, we've had some horrific overruns, haven't we, on certain projects. There are some specifics here. You can't get away from the pandemic having really, screwed a lot of things up. They have, the amount of investment that was going into the core valley lines to do almost nothing, just holding operations in some cases because of the pandemic. Throw on top of that some pretty difficult inflationary pressures, and they have. We've almost had a decade before this period. We have had a decade of pretty stable, low inflation, low interest rates, great for businesses and great for estimating projects as well, because you've got that stability. You haven't had that over the last 2 years. And, I was meeting with our members on a monthly basis to talk about the cost increases on materials. If you could get them, the costs were going up. You were literally having to put your orders in for steel today, because by tomorrow it would have gone up by another 5%. So, it has been incredibly difficult to do that. But of course, if you're talking of projects at that scale, then a 5% increase is massive, really. And wouldn't it be great to have a Barnett Consequential from HS2 and Northern Powerhouse? That would solve all our problems, wouldn't it? Because the both those situations are absolutely ridiculous. But if that came in to the coffers of the Welsh Government, God, we could make such a difference.
I just think the rail, it does get the lion's share of funding, but the criticism for the budget going overrun is a hard one, because, like you said, it's incredibly hard with inflation and the pandemic to put amounts on that. But it's obviously a big hit for Welsh Government and got them tied up in last year's underspend. They had to return to Treasury kind of issue, because I think we all know where that 155 million was going to go.
Just working on that, it's amazing to think of what an extra £6.5 billion could do to the Welsh Government budget. And that's not just in terms of transport, that's in terms of everything else that could, make it easier perhaps to get the modal shift that we desire. But Paolo, it is modal shift I want to talk to you about. How far along the line do you think we are, and what more could the Welsh Government do in order to inspire this modal shift?
I want to say one thing about bus services as well, just because that's part of modal shift. I think that one thing that hasn't been mentioned is how important an equality issue bus services are as well. Because the people that rely most on bus services are people that live in rural Wales, but also people that are most vulnerable. So beyond it being an easy win to some extent in terms of investment, it also is an equality issue. And as the Welsh Government being forward-looking and really about making sure that the most vulnerable don't suffer more, I think that the bus services and the bus industry needs funding for obvious equality reasons as well. I mean, the funding question is also I know you asked me about modal shift, but it comes down to funding at the end of the day as well. It's how much funding we now invest in making the alternatives suitable, making them viable, making them attractive and accessible, and making sure that they're there in some cases. And I think we have a long way to go. I think there is also behavior change that's needed. And there'll be a comms aspect to that as well, not just about making sure the infrastructure is there, but also making people aware that the infrastructure is there and usable and accessible to them, and making sure that the user experience is nice, and also making sure that nice user experience is shared and known so that people actually want to use those services. I mean, speaking to my housemate who came back on the train and had train cancellations and rail replacement services just a couple of days ago, and she was just saying, well, it's discouraging her to use public transport. And that's, I think, one of the massive issues we're facing, is the fact that currently the offer isn't attractive enough, and that will require investment in infrastructure as well as in the softer, I guess, measures of like getting people back onto public transport. And funding. I mean, that is all an issue of funding at the end of the day. And I have a lot to say about the HS2 consequential, but I guess we might get onto that in a little bit.
Oh, don't worry. We absolutely will have a whole section on that. Whilst you're talking about equalities, Paola, I think one of the groups that has been concerned about the lack of engagement they've had, with whether it be with the panel or with Welsh Government, are disabled people who are concerned that for a lot of them, their car is their way to experience the world. You know, they struggle to get on trains. The taxi provision is terrible in some places. Buses are not always the easiest to get on. This is one of these areas that I always find myself talking about. But how do Welsh Government move on from that? And do there need to be a carve out to so the messaging isn't always so absolute, so that there is an understanding that some people aren't always able to have this shift?
Yeah, I mean, there's something to say about the fact that this is not the roads review isn't just a ban on all roads, and also that it's a move towards easing congestion, arguably to make the roads more usable for those that will continue using them. So I think that as a broader kind of issue, easing congestion will help people that have to use cars, and also other I guess freight and logistics, hopefully. But then, yeah, I mean, there is a lack of engagement with disability groups. And I mean, that's something that I was working on already at Sustrans, trying to work a lot more with Disability Wales at the time. But it's difficult to do, but also it needs to be done, and it needs to be done better. And I think, yeah, there's a lot, that we tend to talk in our silos, and equality has to be part of transport. And the way that our sustainable transport means are more accessible to people with disabilities is one of the issues. And obviously making sure that it's not, the messaging isn't just, we're just not doing any more roads because roads are rubbish anyway and nobody needs them. It's like, that's not what it's about. But I think it's, just making sure that we talk to everybody and not just the people we tend to normally speak to.
Yeah, I just come in on that, Matt. I think a couple of things. So I think Paola's points around kind of equality and social justice. The bus is such an important part of the social fabric of Wales, and I think train journeys and the infrastructure in trains and the debate around the budget at the moment gets a lot of attention. But 3 times as many people catch a bus every day as catch a train, and I think it's quite easy to forget that. And I think politicians have been reminded over the last few months with threats to some of those services how important the bus is to people. And often, because of the pricing structures, because of the distance of journeys, bus is a much more affordable option. So for the poorest people in society, accessing services where they might only need to make one journey a week to go to the job centre or to their local surgery or whatever, it's a much, much more affordable option. So we're not just talking kind of big economics here. This is local, personal stuff, and it's really, really important. And you asked the question on modal shift. I mean, if I can be blunt, we're absolutely miles off. We did a piece of research which we launched prior to me joining in January, and it estimated that the current kind of policy environment, the current context, would deliver about 34% by 2050 of the modal shift that's needed. So there's about 118% gap with the kind of transformative nature of what is needed to get us there. And I think it's really easy to kind of get into simplistic, do we change the bus pricing structure? Do we build different types of road, et cetera, et cetera? But to deliver that scale of transformation, we're going to need a package of policy reforms, and it's not one thing. So I've talked about bus prioritization. That's only part of it. We need to increase the attractiveness of the bus network, and hacking away at services at the moment is not going to help that. We do need to make buses cheaper. I think if you look at what's happened in Scotland recently, they've made buses free for under 22s. They've seen a huge spike in people using the bus. And just speaking anecdotally, I was with Edward's coaches today in Pontyclun, and they were talking in glowing terms about the trial that RCT have run for free buses over the last few weeks. They've seen 40% increase there in the numbers of people catching the bus locally. So we do need to do that, but we also need to get into discouraging the use of cars. We need to get into kind of behavioural interventions that Paul has talked about, and I just don't see any kind of vision on this stuff at the moment. The roads review is positive. But we're in this kind of vicious cycle at the moment where it doesn't feel like any of public transport is particularly attractive in lots of parts of Wales. And the worse the problem gets, the more we get into that cycle. And it's very, very hard to shift from there to that kind of longer term vision.
Yeah, this is going to be very revealing to everybody who listens to this podcast and doesn't know I am the biggest city boy on the planet, only ever having lived in Cardiff and London. So rural connectivity is something I do on the weekends rather than as a daily basis. But having lived in London, I know that the reason that public transport works so well in London is because it is simultaneously really easy to use public transport and an absolute nightmare to drive a car.
Not to jump on that, Matt, but I think that a lot of people talk about London as this kind of this panacea, this utopian kind of land for public transport. One of the reasons London works is you've got the critical mass of people to make it work and to make it commercially stack up. And I think one of the risks, we haven't talked about franchising, we probably aren't going to have time to kind of get into it in any great depth, but one of the risks is that Welsh Government's aspiration towards franchising of bus services at the moment, they are looking at what's happened in London over the years. They're looking at what's happening in Manchester. London and Manchester aren't Wales. London and Manchester aren't even Cardiff. I mean, Cardiff doesn't really have the type of population and density of population to make a London or Manchester model work. So I agree. I've spent a lot of time in London. I think it's fantastic, but we probably can't get there, and we need to be honest about that.
What's brilliant, Aaron, is that you stole my next question about franchising. So I'm now very happy to move over to hand back over to Kerry.
I know. I was just loving Aaron's point around London and that we cannot become those kind of big English metropolitan areas as much as we might want to be.
So Ed, as well as your civil engineering hat, you do some work with pedal power, obviously, trying to make cycling more inclusive. Where do you think we are with the active travel sector at the moment?
Well, we've certainly seen investment through the pandemic period, and it was great. I tell you what, from a business point of view, it was fantastic because we were really, really struggling. But yeah, we've seen that. We've seen it. We've seen the results, I think, in areas like Cardiff. I speak about Cardiff because I'm there most of the time, but I'm actually up in the north at the moment, not far from Llanbedr, actually, where the bypass was cancelled. Anyway, we won't go back to that one just yet. The active travel here is a different animal, as is public transport and buses, really. I take the point that we're not, Cardiff is not a London or a Manchester. Nevertheless, it's got a damn sight better chance of getting the public transport thing working alongside active travel, discouraging the car and all the rest of it. So I can see how that works. And coming back to the Welsh Government's policy on Llwybr Newydd, perfect. The two go hand in hand. my and our as a sector biggest sort of grievances, should we say, with Llwybr Newydd was that urban versus rural bit. It's such an urban-centric policy and approach. And the other one is around freight. I've witted and gone completely off track now, haven't I, with active travel. I'm going to come back to active travel now. I suppose what I see is in terms of the likes of Cardiff, active travel, you wherever you go now, there are cycle lanes everywhere, bus lanes. It is working, I think, quite well. And as somebody who likes to cycle, it makes it safer for me to get back on the bike in town centres. If I bring the disability thing and the equality thing, if we're going to do active travel for all, I think we've got a long way to go on that. As a trustee with Pedal Power, a charity which provides adapted bikes for disabled people, we've got all the facilities there to be able to encourage more people who lack confidence, people who are disabled, to share in the same benefits that able-bodied people can do around Cardiff. And yet, if you look at the way a lot of these projects are designed, they're not conducive to people with disabilities on adapted bikes. And this has been an issue long before the whole active travel thing sprung up. But you would have thought by now that had they been adequately catered for, you would have had the design skills in place. You'd have had people driving this. I'm kind of looking at Paula now, but, Sustrans have a role in this. And I know you've tried to push it. But given that so much of this investment has come through local government, I'm not convinced that they've been particularly hot on this. I don't think they've been particularly. They put all the sort of the normal bits in, should we say, but in terms of adapting them for disabled people, I think it's a long, long way to go, and that's such a shame because this investment won't last forever. I suspect by the time it's gone, we might get around to thinking about disabled people.
I worked at Sustrans a year and a half ago now. I mean, there is already struggles on the delivery side when it comes to even just active travel routes themselves and active travel infrastructure themselves on local authority level. So I think the behaviour change comes down slowly. And then obviously the disability side of things is even more slow to trickle down. So I think there is a lot of work to be done on that. To some extent, at the time, my colleagues at Sustrans were involving people early on in the design stages as well to make sure that there was another perspective on the design of the infrastructure. But yeah, there's a long way to go, and it's very dependent on which council is more interested in doing more on that. And yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on that. And I mean, living in the north, as you say, it's a whole different beast. But saying that, I mean, Bangor could really benefit from some active travel routes as well. It's like there is still stuff that can be done in smaller towns that would make a difference to local transport and active travel as well.
My local part of Cardiff has lost its bus service due to a poorly designed active travel route, which I am fuming about, and I'll carry on until I get my bus reinstated. But I am going to take us. Basically,
what that ward should have done in 2017, Kerry, is vote for me, and then we would have had a completely different kind of conversation. That's all I'm going to say.
Anyway, Violet, we are going to go left field now. We've done buses, we've done rail, we've done roads. We try to shoehorn everything in, and I think each of these areas could have had their own pod, and I think we will come back to some of them later in the year. But the one area we haven't mentioned is the air sector. Cardiff Airport has been in the news recently as ITV have looked back over the past decade in public ownership. And I think the one thing we can take from that decade is that it's been very, very costly to the Welsh public purse. I'm not going to focus on Wales, but April the 1st saw the UK government halve domestic air passenger tax. That's got to be a really backward step, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite an interesting one. It's just very biased, isn't it? I mean, we've had that happen on April the 1st, and then we've had, the fuel duty frees continue whilst the rail fares are increasing. And I mean, at some point there needs to be something changed in terms of how. We just need to stop being biased in terms of which types of transport we subsidise and which we don't, and how much we subsidise which, and how we use the funding from those maybe towards others? I don't know. There's a big question about funding and how we get creative with funding, because clearly there is an issue and we don't have much money, and Welsh Government are between a rock and a hard place, even though obviously we still need to campaign for them to invest more in the right transport infrastructure. But there is something to be said about how do we get creative here, because and with the stuff happening on UK government level, it's like it's just it's a bit of a losing battle, it feels.
Yeah, I mean, I speak as somebody with who had a recent personal interest in this, because I split my time between South Wales and Scotland for my last role, and it was absolutely crazy to me how often, even when you factor in the more expensive parking, the travel to Bristol Airport, how often flying to Glasgow was the most economically sensible choice. And so then to cut tax further on something which is doing the damage that we know it's doing to the environment and to nature is just, yeah, it's completely bonkers. And I think, I mean, I've seen people again lobbying recently for the reinstatement of the short-lived Cardiff to London flight. It's just striking. We need to kind of extract ourselves from this framework of thinking that the cheapest and these carbon-intensive ways of working are best. And it feels like we've all raised issues with current public transport policy in Wales today, but when you look back at where this stems from, the roads review coming from a government that wants to take action on climate, wants to take action on all of the kind of issues of well-being, it feels like at least we're in a better starting point than one who is willing to hack the tax off domestic flights. I think it's a good starting point to be at, and there's lots of problems with that, which I'll leave to others.
So interestingly, is it still Welsh Government policy to have air passenger duty devolved to Wales, with you'd assume the intention to cut it? I do agree with you, but it is interesting to see that at least I haven't seen anything publicly a change in that policy. Kerry, you're nodding, so I think know.
No, I think they still want it devolved, but I wouldn't like to say which way they'd go with it now. We've got a very forthright transport minister in Lee, who I don't think he would cut it. May well even go back up. But the funding is interesting. It's one of our last questions to all three of you, really. We've talked about Barnett Consequential, and the big one for Wales is the HS2 Consequential, which, if we followed the normal kind of funding formula, it's at least 5 billion to Wales from HS2. It could fund all that we want. The £100 million tram in Cardiff Bay. We could even lengthen it to some useful places in Cardiff. Ed, that's something we've got to look at, really, isn't it? How it's back to funding from the UK on some of these big capital infrastructure programs.
Yeah, it is. Look, I think, going right to the very start of this, really, the challenge for us in Wales was always going to be introducing, the alternative transport options kind of before or as we wound down the roads investment. These kind of decisions to not grant Wales consequentials HS2, where the Department for Transport's own studies show that Wales is in a detrimental position. The North possibly okay if certain things happen, but overall, I think it's about £150 million a year, a hit to the economy. That cannot be, an England-Wales project. Otherwise, it just shows really where Wales stands. And then the Northern Powerhouse thing, just to rub salt in the wounds again. Yeah, I can be political here, can I? This is me, my personal view now. But the whole thing about rail devolution, I think a lot of Labour MPs and Senate members need to hang their heads in shame on this, because we've had the opportunities to have rail devolved. That would have taken the whole issue around consequentials out of it, and we'd be having different discussions, as they're having in Scotland, where they're able to invest properly in their rail network up there. And if Transport for Wales really want to get stuck into integrated transport plans and so on, if they haven't got that access to those kinds of monies and the decision making as well, then it's going to be really, really difficult. And there's a reason why rail and road should be integrated but are not integrated, and that's because of the way the structures are set up. Roads have always been devolved to Wales, dealt with by local authorities. Rail hasn't. It's been Network Rail. That's a massive beast. You try and get Network Rail to change and play ball and integrate and take decisions for the common good. My God, it's really, really difficult. So you've got a whole issue there around investment levels, but you've also got the underpinning structures, and they're not right in Wales at the moment. And personally, I think we need rail devolved. And one of the reasons why it wasn't, or people said it wasn't, was around the risk factor. If you had a major catastrophe and a right failure, well, that's only going to happen if you haven't done your asset transfer properly and understanding what your assets are. So I don't buy that at all. It was a political decision not to do it, and we're really paying the price for it now.
Aaron, I'm interested in your view, because we're talking capital here. But one of the big issues I've got with Welsh Transport is the revenue side of it. I am really, really nervous around the South Wales Metro long-term revenue, because I think it'll be detrimental to buses. But again, if we had this kind of funding through Barnett from the UK government, it would make that picture a lot happier as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, Harry, you need both capital and revenue to make the transport system stack up. We've talked about the need for investment in existing infrastructure, and you need capital to do that. Interestingly, we're the only part of the UK that doesn't have a defined capital budget for investment in zero emissions buses at the moment. So we could do a lot of interesting things with capital to drive us towards modal shift. I think, to take the revenue point, and I didn't kind of speak too much about the tension at the moment with the funding of the rail system and Transport for Wales. I think there's a risk that we end up kind of debasing the argument for all public transport by playing one off against the other. And actually, to achieve modal shift, we need successful rail and successful bus and successful active travel. They all need to be in harmony, and they all need to speak to each other. So there are risks to the bus sector from a transport budget which seems to be being ploughed into rail at the moment, but we need both. And I think that means hard decisions for ministers on how they make the case for that, and how they secure the budget for it, and how we use our tax raising powers and various borrowing powers to make things work properly. Decisions around consequentials on HS2 and Northern Powerhouse clearly don't help that, and I think speak to intergovernmental relations between Wales and the UK, which are not satisfactory and don't help any of us.
Yes, on the HS2, I mean, I come at it from a campaigning perspective. We just need as many voices as possible to fight for a consequential. It might never happen, we don't know. Okay, but we still need all politicians that can to talk about this being an issue. And because at the end of the day, Welsh Government have limited amounts of money. Okay, so this is a fact. We need to solve this. So what are the options? And I mean, we've been... because Transport Action Network run a lot of legal actions against the UK government, against national highways. Obviously we talk about it in legal terms as well. And so do we need a legal action against UK government on this? I don't know. The Barnett Consequential is a really important one in terms of, if we had that, look at where we could be. And I think all politicians should be challenging this. And as many voices as possible should be highlighting how much Wales lost out on it. And I mean, just watching how the Conservatives have a tendency of saying that this is benefiting Wales, it's just not that true. I mean, there's some very marginal benefits, okay, but realistically, I mean, I live on the North Wales line. Getting to London that little bit quicker is not useful. And also, we much would prefer a better system within Wales than being linked to London just that slightly bit quicker. So yeah, I think the Barnett Consequential one needs to be more on the table and spoken about much more outright and campaigned for and lobbied for by politicians and organisations.
It's a really interesting point that actually in Wales, in the Senedd, there is complete political unanimity. Everybody in that building believes that Wales should receive its fair share of Barnett Consequentials, but as with many things, it's not a Welsh problem, it's a Westminster one. And before I get into any more trouble, I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for coming on the show this evening to talk to us. If people want to find you on social media, perhaps Twitter, if you're still there, where can they go? Paula?
On Twitter, we can be followed at Tan Cymru, I think is our handle.
Fab. Aaron?
I'm Tweets by A Hill and the organisation CPT UK.
And Ed?
Tweets at Seeker Wales.
And if you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find Hiraeth on the socials at HiraethPod, or go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/HiraethPod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.